if you went back 20 years, you're talking about mainly small numbers of male to female transitioners post 18. Now, what's happened since 2000 has been this huge increase in numbers presenting to the clinic. But the other thing is who's presenting has changed. So now you've got mainly girls transitioning to boys, and the age at which drugs are prescribed has got younger and younger. And one of the problems with this whole area is, as Hilary Cass pointed out, the lack of science. That's one thing. But you've also got this problem with the politicization of the whole area. So that the politics has started to influence the clinical practice. And David Bell, psychoanalyst colleague of mine, he'd been approached by 10 members of staff with very similar complaints. Not enough psychological evaluation, worried that we were fast tracking these kids towards a medical solution to basically a psychological problem. And then at the same time, 10 parents had written saying their kids were being treated by the JID service, and they were very disappointed with the quality of psychological evaluation of their kids.
Evans, thanks very much for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
We're going to talk about some more controversial topics today. When you were previously on, I think you came on earlier around episode 14, something like that. We talked about psychoanalysis and we dove deep into those concepts. Today we're going to be talking about the Tavistock Gender Identity Clinic. What happened with that? You are one of the whistleblowers which contributed to that service getting shut down. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, the Cass report published by Dr. Hilary Cass, a pediatrician, all about the Tavistock and different ways that it could be running its service has been published. Funnily enough, the Royal College of Psychiatrists has just published a response to the Cass reports, which we can talk about. So we're going to dive into all of that today. But first, the question, maybe just to frame the conversation, which in a way that I think could be helpful. You're a psychoanalyst. How do you view your job as a psychoanalyst?
Well, it's trying to meet with people, think about themselves and what they're struggling with. It's trying to offer an opportunity in terms of working with people to understand, help them understand through the process, through the relationship, the psychoanalytic relationship, trying to understand how they tick so that they might be in a better position to make decisions about their lives.
And the interesting thing about the psychoanalytic role is, about psychoanalytic philosophy, is that it doesn't take things at face value. Often someone might come with a particular, let's say, presenting problem to psychoanalysis. That might be, I don't like my job. And then through the process of psychoanalysis, there's deeper things uncovered, deeper motivations, sometimes psychological conflicts, conflicting motivations. So what might start as, I don't like my job, might end up as something way more deep and complicated, like, I have problems with authority, say, for example, or I have a deep fear of not performing up to my potential, things like that. So with that frame of depth in mind, can you tell me a little bit about the history of the Tavistock Gender Identity Service?
Well, I'm not an expert on the history. I mean, but what I can say is that the Tavistock is the sort of national training centre for psychotherapy. That's systemic and psychoanalytic. And its history is in thinking psychologically about developmental psychology, individual psychology, group psychology, and institutions. There was a period of time when there was a big preoccupation with institutions. So the Gender Identity Development Service came in the early 2000s to the clinic, and it was a very small service at that time and very different in terms of the Tavistock's traditional approach to understanding psychological difficulties, in that there was an idea that medication might, it was thought of as a sort of pause for thought. So if you can imagine kids coming into adolescence and puberty that weren't quite ready to struggle with the physiological, psychological, and sociological turbulence caused by puberty, that there would be a sort of block for a period of time while they caught up with their minds, caught up with their bodies, if you like. So we were only talking about small numbers in the early 2000s. But what I'm trying to emphasize, it was a sort of departure from the Tavistock's traditional approach. I should think that Tavistock's got about 3 prescription pads in the whole of the trust, not very many, and people don't tend to prescribe much medication.
So it was a departure in the sense that it was using much more of a biological medical framework as opposed to a more depth psychology framework. Is that a fair way to put it?
It absolutely. It might have fitted more in with the Maudsley and the Maudsley traditional approach than the Tavistock. So it's a funny marriage, really. It's a funny place for the service to be based.
And then how did the service develop from there?
Well, the service, as I say, was very small. And if you went back in time in psychiatry, the population was very different in terms of who was presenting. So if you went back 20 years, you're talking about mainly small numbers of male to female transitioners post 18. They had a sort of similar profile in that they often had long-standing ideas that they were in the wrong gender. Now, what's happened since 2000 has been this huge increase in numbers presenting to the clinic. But the other thing is, who's presenting has changed. So now you've got mainly girls transitioning to boys, and the age at which drugs are prescribed has got younger and younger. And one of the problems with this whole area is, as Hilary Cass pointed out, the lack of science. That's one thing. But you've also got this problem with the politicization of the whole area. So that the politics has started to influence the clinical practice, which has pushed back the age at which kids can get cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers younger and younger and younger. So there's been an enormous change since 2000 to what was going on last year at the Tavistock.
Do you have a strong view on why the patient profile has changed so much from predominantly boys transitioning to girls to many more females transitioning to male?
I really don't know. I'm not a sociologist. I mean, obviously, there are all sorts of views about the sort of sexualization of girls, about the vulnerability of girls, about the sort of social media. You're either a sort of perfect girl with a perfect image, or you don't quite fit. So there's all sorts of important thoughts about what's going on in society. It's not that I'm dismissing it. I think it's extremely important. And in a way, what's happened since Cass and since the whistleblowers have started raising questions about this is these important questions are starting to be looked at. I mean, maybe I could go through the history of how this all unfolded. Is that
Yeah, let's go through the history of what happened and how you became involved.
Yeah. So my wife, she worked in the service. She's a general nurse and a psychiatric nurse, and she did a psychotherapy training. And she was partly employed in the Tavistock, which, as I say, is mainly a large outpatient psychotherapy department with a lot of training attached. But a job came up in the JID service, and she applied and got the job, and she got rather worried very early on that what she saw was that kids who often had complex problems with comorbidities and trauma, some of them were quite quickly, after say 2 or 3 appointments, were then deemed to be trans, and they'd be sent off to UCL to start on puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. And she raised questions about what was going on, saying, but hang on a minute, you've only seen this kid 3 times. This is quite a complex presentation. This is rather worrying. And she felt that her questions were not welcome. Now, I was a manager at the Tavistock for 20 years, and I thought this is very unusual because the Tavistock's quite a multidisciplinary place in which there's a lot of discussion about what's going on with the presenting problem, as you were talking about. We're looking beneath the surface, trying to understand who this individual is and why they're presenting in this particular way. So to suddenly be told by Sue that her questions and curiosity about the family dynamics and what's going on in the background weren't really welcome was very odd. Anyway, she struggled on, for quite a long period of time, questioning the team, but she really felt that this was counterculture. This was not welcome, and she was causing trouble. In the end, we had a discussion about it, and she went to see David Taylor, who was the medical director at the time. He brought in Jim McKeith, who was a senior psychiatrist, forensic psychiatrist from the Maudsley, to help as an external person. So why I'm saying that is David Taylor took this complaint of Sue's extremely seriously to bring in an external senior person. Now, what then happened was that report was basically buried. I mean, the trust is only small, and all the managers from all the different departments would meet once a month, and we go through the various different reports from the various different parts of the trust. I checked this out with a couple of other directors from the time. We all confirmed we never saw that report. The report was never discussed, and Sue said it was never discussed with the team. Now, and this was a real puzzle, like what happened to it? I'll then move on. So then, anyway, she resigned. She couldn't work there. After a period of time, she found it too distressing. And then I retired from the NHS in 2018. I took up a role as governor on the Board of Governors. And David Bell, psychoanalyst colleague of mine, he'd been approached by 10 members of staff with very similar complaints. Not enough psychological evaluation, worried that we were fast tracking these kids towards a medical solution to basically a psychological problem.
Sorry, was that 10 members of staff or 10 parents of patients?
So there were 10 members of staff, and then at the same time, 10 parents had written saying their kids were being treated by the JID service, and they were very disappointed with the quality of psychological evaluation of their kids. Then a period of 6 months went by in which I was asking to see Dave Bell's report. As a new governor, I wasn't allowed to see the report. I argued about it.
And as a governor, would your role be to oversee the quality of the care and the service?
Yeah.
That's part of the job, right?
Yeah, you're there to sort of make sure the trust is doing its job, really. Anyway, there was a sort of long battle. I won't go into the details, but effectively over 2 things. One was I wanted to see the report, and I didn't need to see the report because the trust had asked the current medical director to do their own report. And I said, that's fine, I'll read that, but I want to see Dave Bell's report as well, because I want to know what the disquiet was that the staff were bringing up. The other thing was I asked that Dave Bell would attend the final meeting. There was going to be a final meeting at which the medical director's report was going to be sort of discussed. Anyway, we didn't get anywhere. Eventually, I was allowed to see Dave Bell's report just before we discussed the medical director's report. By this time, I felt the trust were trying to bury the problem, as Dr. Taylor's report had been buried. And I thought that was very irresponsible, given that, this is an experimental treatment on vulnerable kids with very little evidence of any substantial nature. So anyway, I voted through the report, although I wasn't very happy. I raised all sorts of questions about it. The next day, the trust released something basically saying everyone's passed the medical director's report. He'd given the service a clean bill of health. There were no problems, and Dave Bell didn't have the credentials to do this investigation anyway. And on that note, I then thought, I'm wasting my time trying to talk to the trust. I'm actually going to take this thing outside. I'm going to resign. Now, what I was surprised with, when I resigned, I got contacted by all sorts of journalists who knew a lot more than I was expecting about this issue. I felt very anxious. I thought my career was over and I was finished.
Were you being criticized? Were you being attacked at
Not
this
at
time?
that time, but then I did an article in the Daily Mail. I did one in the Sunday Times. And I thought everyone's going to hate me. Anyway, and the people didn't hate me. What then happened was I was invited to a meeting at the House of Lords, and one of the striking things about that meeting, and it tells you something about this very odd world that we're living in, was that every MP and every Lord, that's over 1,400 people have been invited. Only one Tory MP turned up, and he'd been warned by the party whips. If he turned up to the meeting, he could say goodbye to any progression in his career. And Tanny Gray Thompson, the wheelchair Olympic athlete from the House of Lords. We had people from the States. There was an endocrinologist. There was a member of a parents group. There was a woman called Stephanie Davis-Arai who knows all about education. Anyway, we presented. Dave Bell wasn't allowed to talk because he'd been banned by the trust, but he attended the meeting and spoke from the floor. And Sue also attended. And it was nice to meet people who were already having these concerns and in many ways had been involved in it a long time, although I knew the history from when Sue worked in the service in 2005. So it was familiar to me. We retired to the pub and the question was, well, what do you do when the medical authorities, usually evidence and consensus, and we come to some sort of agreement. But when the medical authorities seem so captured by ideology and the whole thing had become so politicized, you can't really rely on the medical authorities. So that was when the idea of taking the whole thing to judicial review. And then, cutting a long story short, Sue started the judicial review with a woman called Mother A. Mother A had a daughter who was autistic who wanted to transition. The mother was very worried about where this would lead. So Sue and Mother A started the case. And then Kira Bell was someone who was seen by the Tavistock after 4 appointments, cross-sex hormones, double mastectomy, and then 3 years later thought the whole thing was a mistake and there hadn't been sufficiently rigorous psychological evaluation.
How old was she when she was treated?
She was 16, and they would meet. The meetings would take place over quite long periods of time, so you wouldn't see people on a weekly basis. You'd see them once every 6 weeks or something. They won the case. The legal case was, can a 11-year-old consent to treatment which may end up with them going on a medical conveyor belt, which will end up with them being sterile when they're 20. Can an 11-year-old make that decision? And the judges basically said no. But one of the other things that took place was that the evidence or lack of evidence was scrutinised by 3 High Court judges. And they were alarmed about, I mean, I'm putting words in their mouth, but if you were at the court, I wasn't there, but Sue gave me an account. And the lack of interest in comorbidities, the JID service didn't know the fact that 30% of these kids are on the autistic spectrum, and the lack of serious evidence, which is what Cass showed up. So it was then made public, the sort of thinness of the evidence that has been backing all of this up. The Tavistock appealed, and it was thrown out of court. Now the thing was, what people think is that our side of the case was defeated. That wasn't true. The judge thought this was not a legal matter; it was a medical matter. So it didn't even get into the court. But what the government did was realise that we've got a serious problem here, and that we've got to have a look at what the state of the evidence is. And they brought in Hilary Cass. So that's a potted history of a sort of with all sorts of important elements to it. That the journalists played an important part, but the court played an important part, and then the government played an important part in saying there's something very seriously wrong here that we need to get a top clinician to look at and think about. So
it's interesting that the government, not only was the government not interested, but it seemed like the government was just as motivated to bury what was happening up until the judicial review.
I don't think it's just the government, actually, Alex. I think our medical institutions, nobody's wanted to get involved. It's been such a nasty, and it is such a nasty environment. You think that Hilary Cass has been told she can't go on public transport. It's such a nasty area. No one has wanted to stick their head above the parapet. That's the government, the medical authorities. I'm glad that the Royal College of Psychiatrists have said something. I'd like to ask them where they've been for the last 3 years. But anyway, we'll keep things above board.
Well, let's stick our heads further above the parapet then. You make the case that the service was captured by ideology. I'd like to dig into what that ideology could be, but first, how would you summarize the evidence for the opposing side? What evidence is there that the gender affirming pathway that they were using is the correct pathway?
Well, there was one study done in Holland on 70 kids, 20 of whom dropped out, one of whom ended up dead under mysterious circumstances years ago. The whole thing is based on the Dutch protocol. And looking at the results of the Dutch protocol, as people have done subsequently, the whole thing was debunked anyway. So, as Cass has said, to call it evidence is the wrong term. Cass came to the conclusion a lot of stuff that is purported to be evidence is actually very poor quality research. I can remember, I used to run the parasuicide service at King's in the 1980s, and what was bandied around then, which is another example of pseudoscience, was all but 1% of the small numbers of people transitioning make a successful transition. The fact is that I saw quite a few people who would undergo sexual reassignment surgery. They believed that would be the solution to their problems. It wasn't. And then they take an overdose and they'd end up in King's Casualty. And I knew that because of the proportions that it was more than 1% even back then. But this this statistic used to get bandied around. Now, before I resigned, the last meeting with the medical director, he did this report about the JID service. I said to him, "Where's the follow-up? Where's the follow-up for this service?" I used to do the follow-up data for the adult department. Had to do it every 3 months, produce data, as you will in the Maudsley and elsewhere, for commissioners. No follow-up. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. These services are, and then when Cass contacted the adult services, they're either not following people up or they're not willing to release the data. I mean, these services are not functioning as medical services. They're functioning, it's sort of shifted into sort of the world of consumer choice, really. One of the things that was always purported as sort of evidence is the patient satisfaction questionnaires, that they got very high ratings, as if that is equivalent to sort of outcome studies and research. I mean, it's not.
So you've made the case that actually the amount of scientific evidence backing up the treatments that were prescribed, the treatments that were given to children, is very poor. And you're making the case that rather it was more a political, ideological motivation. Now, how would you summarize the ideology of gender affirmative care?
Yeah.
What do they believe?
Yeah. I just want to come back to one more thing which is important about that. The affirmation model. Ken Zucker is the biggest researcher in this area. What was researched was watchful waiting. If you leave these kids through puberty, something like 90% in terms of their gender dysphoria will desist. It sort of works, adolescence, all sorts of turbulence, people don't like it. Most of us struggle with adolescence and all the various changes going on. But if you can stick with it, it will desist. That's got a research base. That was basically dumped in favor of the affirmation model, which has no research base. So again, the ideology is dominating the clinical scene. Sorry, go back to your question, Alex. I'll answer it now. I can't remember what it was. God.
How would you summarize the ideology of gender affirmative care?
Well, a lot of the kids that would present, so now Sue and I wrote a book because we were contacted by so many parents after the judicial review, and then we've taken on cases. So we see, parents and kids on a regular basis. Obviously, the kid and sometimes the parents with them come in pain and distress, and you want to remove that distress. But as you say, short-term solutions like the opioid crisis in America, short-term solutions of removing pain have often got long-term hidden consequences. So your job as a mental health practitioner, as far as I'm concerned, is to do what you say. The kid comes, they've got a narrow preoccupation. I've got one problem with one solution. My job is to say, okay, usually we're complicated human beings. We've got sort of complicated things which contribute to our difficulties. And we want to open things out and have a broad look at who you are, what you might be struggling with. What are these conflicts? How are you managing? What sort of person are you? And rather than narrowing things down with the sort of preoccupation with gender, you're sort of opening things out and seeing how this narrow preoccupation fits with other things that are going on. And that would be my approach. But of course, the kid who feels they've fixed their problem, if only I could fix my gender, if only I could take puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, all my problems will be solved. And they've got this sort of certainty in their belief, which sort of ring fences their ego to some extent and protects them. And then you say, well, let's have a think about who you are. I'm interested in you and what's going on with you. Now, then, in a sense, all of that confusion and angst, which they've got rid of, you're then asking them to re-engage with, and that's difficult. Now then, so you've got to have experienced people who are not going to butt heads with the kid, but they're not going to capitulate to the belief system either. You're going to see behind and try and open things out. Now, in many ways, the ideology is a sort of simplistic approach. It's, if only you gave the kid what they want, everything would be solved. And if you're the adult who's saying, well, things aren't that simple and there's a lot at stake here, we need to slow things down and think about them, you're being patriarchal, you're just trying to control the individual and, in sort of impose your view of what the ideal should be. And of course, that's a misunderstanding of what our role is as mental health practitioners, as psychotherapists. It's not my job to play God and tell people how to live their lives, but it is my job to help them think about the bigger picture and what the costs of any decisions they might make in adulthood. That we've all got to make choices about how we live our lives, and part of that process involves weighing up the benefits and the deficits of any particular decision. So I'd say it sort of gets rid of doubts and confusions. It's in a simplistic way.
Yes, and it's interesting to think about the idea that if someone is presenting themselves with 100% certainty about a very serious decision, they have no doubts, they have no skepticism whatsoever, that's kind of a red flag, because even if you can be confident in a decision but still entertain doubts, and that's a hallmark of psychological maturity, whereas rigid certainty in any area of your life can be kind of suspicious that maybe this certainty isn't what it seems at face value. Maybe this certainty is a rigid defense against deeper anxiety and angst, as you say.
100%, and the services will often purport this. The kid was certain, and exactly as you've just said it, I couldn't say it better myself. You say, but if you're making a serious decision which has got very important implications, you would have doubts and questions. You would want to look at things from different points of view, but that's not how the services would present it, you see. And quite red flag if you have no doubts about a decision that is going to have, could lead to your sterility. Well, where are your doubts? Why don't you have doubts?
Mm. What's it been like for you and your wife to work with kids with gender dysphoria and their parents?
Yeah, so we only see a proportion of the population. So I'm not making claims to say that, this is all of the population. We tend to see parents the parents are skeptical about what's going on. So we get 2 or 3 letters a week, have done since 2020, and the letter will go like this: would you please see our son or daughter? They've got comorbid problems, they've had them for a long time. We're not against them transitioning, but they've gone to the generic services and they've been labelled trans, and they've gone online and they're now part of an online group, and we feel that they're being pulled into something prematurely, and we're very worried about it. Sue would often see the parents. The parents are often very frightened that if they stand up to their kids, that there's this thing that's bandied around about suicidality, which terrifies them. In actual fact, that's another piece of pseudoscience. These kids are no more suicidal than other disturbed adolescents. They're not remarkably different from a lot of the adolescents that you'd be seeing in CAMS services. That's number one. The other thing is that sometimes, and you do hear about it tragically, is that the online groups will say your parents are bigots and they're transphobes. You need to cut them off. We'll look after you. And you do hear of parents who've completely separated from their kids. They have no relationship at all, and the kids just go off to this new family, better family. So one of the most important things is meeting with the parents, and it's how to encourage the parents to re-establish their position as the child's parents, because often they feel pushed around and a bit intimidated by their son or daughter who's saying, you've got to see me in this way, otherwise you're a bigot. And you maintain them right to be a parent. You're worried about your kid, you're entitled to think, and you don't always agree with everything your kid says. And to help them re-establish a sort of position of helpful authority. Now that sometimes has quite dramatic results. You do get occasionally, the parents will contact in several weeks' time and say, oh, actually, my son or daughter has given up the idea. So that's a proportion. And then in terms of the profile, if you thought of someone often with a quite fragile ego, who fragile personality structure, often quite fixed, as you say, around a particular idea. This is my problem, this is my solution. If you said, but what was the problem with being a boy? No, I don't think about that. I don't want to think about that. That's a challenge to the system. And what do you think would be so much better about being a girl? Well, I just am a girl. So a very defended state of mind, which there's very little room for curiosity and looking at things from different points of view. You're then having to say, okay, well, look, we're not going to butt heads about that, but just noticing certain things, the closing down of curiosity, the closing down of doubts, the attempts to sort of open up who they are. Often there's a lot of self-hatred that they're dealing with, and you feel a sort of a long-standing depressive structure in which they're either perfect or they're useless. You often take note of that. So you've been struggling with this for quite a long time. It seems to me it must be terrible to feel you're either perfect or you're useless all the time. They often will sort of move towards you when you say that. So one of the things you're trying to do is get them interested in themselves and their minds, because often, apart from these fixed states in which they make these statements, there's very little room for curiosity. So one of the things we find with a certain proportion, they will become more interested in themselves in a broader way. I'm this sort of person, I'm that sort of person, I tend to have these sorts of ways of operating, and they get engaged. With others, another proportion, they're very difficult to engage because of the lack of freedom of thought, and they want a concrete solution to their concrete problem. And then there's another group who would maybe go on medication, but they continue to come and see us because whether or not they're going to transition, they're still having to think about, because one of the things that detransition has said, of course, what gets sold is you're going to be able to create your own perfect self. It's not put in those ways, or the self that you imagine. And of course, that with the best will in the world, the medics aren't going to provide you with the sex or with the ideal that you've got in your mind. And there's quite a gap, apart from the fact you can't actually change sex, there's quite a gap between what you imagine you're going to be and what you'll actually be. So one needs to sort of think about that before engaging on medical interventions, because if it doesn't work out, then there's a lot more self-hatred than comes around, because you've had all this work done and you're still not what you want to be. Anyway.
And the further complication is, of course, that if, for example, you were a female transitioning to a male and you were put on testosterone, one of the things that testosterone can cause is a feeling of euphoria. So a person could see people in their social group or in their school setting taking testosterone and feeling really good. And then that could seem like the right decision for them. And of course, that's going to be a short-term effect. It's not going to be a long-term effect.
I mean, one of the things is the meaning of the medication. Yeah, I mean, I've written about in the British Journal of Child Psychotherapy, not British Journal, the Journal of Child Psychotherapy, about a case. I've seen a group of cases. They're all groups of cases. I don't write about individual cases, but because of confidentiality, but of traumatized girls, very vulnerable, feel very vulnerable in terms of their sexuality. There's often a wish to, and these thinking is so stereotypical. It's like girls are, sensitive and fragile, and boys are all tough and logical. And that I'm going to deal with this fragile girl who's worried about sexual relations, and I'll take testosterone and I'll become a boy who's much more logical, feels much stronger, much less vulnerable, and that's how I'm going to get my way through life. And there's a lot of excitement about the idea. It's almost like the testosterone is like going to put on a sort of suit of armor, a masculine suit of armor that protects.
Which it kind of does in a way. It kind of does.
It does.
It's going to make you more euphoric, more energetic. It's going to make effort feel good. It's going to make you more able to take risks. So there is some truth in it, and yet it's not necessarily the best long-term pathway for that person.
You see the girl's jaws get squarer in a matter of weeks, certainly months. And there's enormous excitement that they feel that, that this fragile, vulnerable person is going to have this sort of suit of armor, and they get euphoric. As you say, what we don't know, because no one's been interested to follow it up, is what happens to that girl in 10 years' time when the euphoria wears off.
If you had a patient who came with gender dysphoria and who was able to engage, who was able to open up, to be more mentally flexible, to be curious about themselves, to engage in a sort of process of personal growth and psychological maturation, and if at the end of that process, say a year or a couple of years, they still felt that, all things concerned, transitioning in a medical manner was appropriate, is that the kind of thing you would support?
Yeah, I'm, as I said, I don't see it's my role to tell people how to live their lives. And, there's a proportion of the population that makes successful transitions. I'm not attacking the whole idea. What I am is saying that, first of all, I think kids are too young to make these decisions. I think that a lot of the kids that I see, the over 18s, and a lot of them are quite, even, as 19-year-olds, they're quite immature. They're very dependent on their parents. There's lots that they haven't worked out, they're struggling with. And even the sort of young adults, I think, are vulnerable to making rash decisions. But I think, once you've gone through some sort of serious psychological work and lived a little bit of life, if transitioning is the best way of living your life, then, that's up to you. And my job is to is to think with you about that. It isn't to stop you.
Mm.
It's to think with the patient about that.
Now, how much pushback, criticism have you received? Have you been harassed at all about this? Because this is quite common, when people speak out about these issues.
Yeah, I've been called a right-wing Christian bigot. I can't remember the I can't remember the last time I went to chapel, much to my mother's consternation. I'm not right wing. I'm not very political. So anyway, I get called all sorts of things. So does Sue. I had a tweet once, which was the most imaginative, rude, derogatory comment about what this person wanted to do to me. I thought it was quite funny because it was quite imaginative, but anyway, it was pretty horrific. I mean, by and large, I think Sue and I have really stuck to the clinical issues and tried not to get involved with the wider political debates. So we have taken a lot of we in terms of our book. There was a psychoanalyst who published something in the States saying we were transphobic, and that we were. It was psychoanalysis dressed. It was transphobia dressed up as psychoanalysis, and I think that probably had quite a big impact in America in terms of the book. And anyway, so we've had some pretty nasty things said about us, but yeah. And Hilary Cass is getting them at the moment.
Could you summarize the findings in the Cass report, and what are the main recommendations?
So Hilary Cass has built on her interim report in which she said, these kids don't need a service that narrowly preoccupies themselves with their gender. They need a broad, thorough, multidisciplinary report assessment, which looks at all facets of their personality, comorbidities, how they're getting on at school, family dynamics. These are all things that we put in our book, quite a few years ago. But then so she said more or less the same thing. She's also said that the evidence is very poor, and she again is not against transition, but she said there's no evidence for what we've been doing. This was all said before by Carl Hennigan when I was heavily involved in a Panorama program in 2019. Unfortunately, I didn't appear in it because I didn't want to, but I think that was a mistake. But I was involved in setting it up. Carl Hennigan, professor of NICE, he said there's no evidence for any of this treatment. He said that in 2019. So these things have been said consistently. And really, Cass has, in terms of her independence, she had no skin in the game. She's come in, she's got with her team from Yorkshire University, she's done this 4-year review, and she's come to the same conclusion as things that Sue and I and Dave Bell and others have been saying for some time. The other thing to say is the Scandinavian countries, who are all ahead of the curve in terms of transitioning kids, are rowing back. They're also looking at the evidence, and they're pulling the plug on the medicalisation of trans kids because there's no research that justifies it. So what I'm saying is the important thing that she's done is that whilst you can dismiss me, Dave Bell, Sue, others, she's just been brought in to just look at the evidence, and that's what she's done in a very thorough way. And although she's getting attacked left, right, and centre, in actual fact, her credentials are impeccable. She's done a very thorough job, and she's just giving her what was she, the president of the Royal College of Paediatricians. She's giving her view.
And the Royal College of Psychiatry has issued an official response to that statement, which I was reading this morning. And it looks like they unilaterally agree with the recommendations made. They acknowledge that it's a controversial area, that it's a polarizing area, that some people may disagree quite vehemently. But in terms of their actual points of agreement, they feel that they didn't disagree with anything that was outlined in the CAS report, actually.
Well, it's a great relief. And as I said, I had a go at them a bit earlier on in this podcast, but the medical authorities have been very reluctant to get involved. And the NHS England is the same. NHS England and the CQC, although they're now changing their position, in actual fact, they've continued supporting JIDs for quite a long time. And really, they've been asleep at the wheel. I mean, one's sympathetic. Before you put your head above the parapet pit, this is a nasty area. But, we should be governed by clinical evidence. It's not a fact. We're not in the fashion business, and sometimes clinical evidence doesn't go the way people want it to go. But we've got to have the strength to stand up to that sort of intimidation.
How did you feel, you, your wife, a handful of other people, how did it feel to be part of this small group that in the face of everyone else ignoring or suppressing this, the trust, the government, the Royal College of Psychiatry, NHS England, in the face of all of these people either ignoring or suppressing what was happening, how did it feel to have to be part of this small group of people speaking out?
Well, when I mean, going way back, Dave Bell had been forbidden from talking about the issue by the trust. He'd been warned several times.
And how is that? By forbidden, do you mean sort of colloquially? He was forbidden, or was there a legal restraint?
He was formally told he must not talk about this issue. He employed a lawyer to help instruct him about what his rights were. So by the trust.
Was it legal for them to do that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, employment law, there are things you're not allowed to say if your employer says you're not allowed to say them. I mean, so he was, and that went on for a long time, that sort of telling him what he could or couldn't say. I mean, when I was first interviewed by the Times, I thought it was the end of my career. I thought everyone would hate me so much. The thing is, I was fortunate in a way because I'd heard all of this in 2005. I knew there was something very wrong from listening to Sue's experience. I got a journalist phone me up. And he said, how do we know this isn't a one-man conspiracy? Because at that time, there were no other clinicians that would speak. Kirsty Entwistle wrote an open letter I resigned in the February. And until Kirsty Entwistle wrote an open letter. She worked at JIDS and she wrote about her experience in the July. But until that time, the papers would all come to me. And what they'd say would be, are you sure this isn't a one-man conspiracy and vendetta against your old trust? Because we can't get anybody else to go on record and speak to us. Because people employed by their trusts, they felt they would be putting themselves and their careers in a very vulnerable position if they spoke up. I was fortunate. I'd left the NHS and I'm in private practice, and my reputation is pretty good. So I wasn't that worried about it. It wasn't pleasant, but yeah, it was.
But you were worried that your career was over at the same time.
I was, when I did that article. I was worried this was the end of my career. So, but actually, then Kirsty Entwistle spoke up, and then Sue took the judicial review, and there was a lot of interest around that. The interesting thing is the media. The BBC didn't have Sue on Woman's Hour. You got a woman challenging the government about the treatment of children, but they didn't invite her onto Woman's Hour because there's a sort of the Today programme and Newsnight are two exceptions. By and large, the BBC have not wanted to touch this issue, and they stayed away from it. But certain papers have not been afraid. The Times, the Telegraph, the Mail have actually been very good. And then now you've got a lot of left-wing feminist writers writing for the Telegraph because they feel that some of the left-wing media don't welcome them rocking the boat over these issues, so they find themselves employed by the Telegraph. Funny world
it's
we're
interesting.
living in.
It's interesting, and this is exemplified by the J.K. Rowling case, the tension that has evolved between feminism and the trans movement.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, I mean, the feminist movements basically have split over this, haven't they? The gay rights movements have split. Stonewall is split with Stonewall going in one direction and LGB Alliance, and it's a vicious split.
What has this whole experience? I mean, this is so interesting because obviously you're a psychoanalyst, so your whole career has been devoted to trying to get a deep, rich understanding of human nature, and you're coincidentally at the center of this scandal. What has all of this taught you about human nature?
How much we want to belong to the in crowd. No man is an island entire unto himself. We're individuals and we're group animals, and we desperately want to belong. We don't want to be an outlier. And the problem is the cost of belonging sometimes is you give up your capacity to think independently. And sometimes independent thought is categorized as bigotry or prejudice, when actually it's just thought. And it can be, I think you were asking me, how has this gone on for so long? Well, obviously, psychoanalysis and other parts of life, got a bad reputation when dealing with homosexuality and the sort of prejudice about homosexuality. And what's happened is this is sort of piggybacked along with this, as if this is the same sort of problem. So some of the people raising questions, it's misdiagnosed as being coming from a prejudiced position, but actually this is different. You're talking about, you're not talking about choice of sexual partner. You're talking about what you do to one's body, and especially with young kids, and making irreversible changes to a perfectly healthy child's body. It's a different ballgame, but it got lumped in together, and then it's easy to caricature the people questioning the in-group as being bigots and transphobes, and to get them dismissed.
And of course, if you believe the evidence, if you're persuaded by the evidence that most children who are gender dysphoric grow up to be gay, then that's obviously a pro homosexuality stance to take.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things I find about that is actually that gets said a lot, and various groups will, sort of claim their bit of the argument, which is understandable. But our experience is actually it's quite a bit more varied than that. You do get some internalized homophobia, you do get some gay kids, you get some autistic kids, you get some kids with ADHD. It's much more varied than sometimes what comes across. They're not all gay kids. One of the things that you're struck by is often the kids are terrified of the implications of physiological, psychological, sociological development. And in a way, this whole thing of treating the hormone blockers and cross-sex hormones, it's like putting a lid on sexuality, as if sexuality is the gateway into the adult world and what sort of adult you're going to be and who you're going to have sex with and what work you're going to do and how you're going to separate from your parents. In a sense, it's like a sort of Peter Pan syndrome. It's like sort of putting a lid on development and stopping it completely. A lot of the kids we say, I think it was Abigail Shrier says in her book, I mean, I don't know where she gets this information from, but she's a New York Times journalist. And she said that kids are having less sex than they ever have. And certainly that's our experience. A lot of kids are they're in their rooms, they're online, they're actually quite dissociated from their bodies. This body which has got all its desires and passions and is a bit out of control. And in some ways, they're sort of in their minds, in this sort of vantage point, overseeing this body full of all sorts of conflicts and feelings which they rather look down on and want to control. And so the whole transition into the adult world with all of these complexities is rather frightening.
And to what extent do you feel the problem is also contributed to by a sort of a lack of desire or willingness to embrace that whether you're a man or a woman, we have a masculine or a feminine side, which really is a Jungian idea. And of course, most people can relate to this. In some situations, they may feel more masculine, some they may feel more feminine. To what extent do you think that lack of willingness to acknowledge these different parts of ourselves is contributing to this?
Yeah, well, Moni Curl wrote a very important paper called The Facts of Life, where we're all struggling, with our mortality. We'll be on this planet, 80 years and 10 if we're lucky. And then, where we've come from, our relationship with our parents and how that's negotiated, our dependence upon our mother to bring us up, and then coming to terms with the reality of our sexed being. And we all struggle in our various different ways with that sort of process. And I think a lot of these kids are also struggling with it. I think it was Laufer who said that the job of adolescence is to take possession of your sexed body, feel like it's yours. And in many ways, these kids, they're not wanting to take possession of their sex body. It's like they've been given the wrong house, and they don't want the house that they're born with. And I think if we can, help, sort of mourn the loss of the ideal you've got in your mind of the person you think you should have been, and come to terms with who you are. And that involves accepting all sorts of limitations and, to some extent, allowing yourself to orientate yourself to the realities of your biological strengths and weaknesses. But it's not an easy journey for any of us. But we tend to want support in going through that process, rather than think there's a way out. You can create another sort of person. Many of these kids, they're sort of non-binary. It's as if they're never decided who they are. They're living in a fluid world, opposite to the certainty we talked about before, that they'll never be defined. They're indefinable.
Yeah. Because choices, every choice you can make in life, whether it's career, who you're going to marry, but even what gender you are, every choice brings with it a set of restrictions.
100%, and having to accept the losses involved in saying, yeah, I'm going to become a psychoanalyst. I'm not going to be an accountant in the city.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good point to end on. Marcus, thank you for bringing your insight to today's conversation. And, thank you for helping to move this conversation forward at a time when many people are really not willing to have that conversation.
Well, thanks very much for having me. And I'm glad the conversations move forward, and I'm glad that the Royal College of Psychiatrists has made the statement they've made.
Shout out to the Royal College.